Hello and welcome. My name is Mary Van Dyke. I'm the owner of Finding Grandpa, and this series is called Building the Bridge Back to Ireland, using various websites to find documents that might show where in Ireland your ancestors are from and where to look once you get across the pond. This introduction is the first of 9 in the series, where I describe the various parts as well as give you an idea of why it's so hard to find records on our Irish ancestors. Part 2 is cluster genealogy. I'll tell you what it is and why you need to do it. Part 3 are American records. What type of record should you be looking for that might show where in Ireland your ancestors are from? Part 4 and 5 are various websites that you might be able to find those records at. Part 6 are the various Irish records you can find. Part 7 is all about Griffiths valuation, specifically at Ask About Ireland. And that particular one is my favorite. I had to dedicate a whole section on this one alone. Part 8 and 9 are various websites with Irish records. Had to split this up also because there are so many websites that I want to talk about. I didn't want to make the actual videos too long. Before we begin, all the websites listed in these series are samples only. They certainly don't represent everything available out there on the internet. They are websites that I use often, and I flip-flop back and forth between them constantly because the websites have different databases, and I don't stick with one or two. I go to multiple sites. Be aware that some of the websites I might say are free might change in the future and have fees attached. Various surnames are used in the examples of the slideshows, and I don't want to confuse you. One sample might say McDonald, and the very next sample actually might say O'Reilly. So just be aware, I'm just showing you a variety of records with different names. Now, location in Ireland is critical. Most of us can find our ancestors in a county, some type of record that shows they're from a certain county in Ireland, but you really have got to try to find the townland where they're from. It's basically a neighborhood or a small town within a metro area. But once you know a location, records on family members can be found. Now, this image right here shows the 4 generations of my great-grandmother, Delia Sweeney, from Loch Ray. These are all her relatives. And in 2008, this is the list I was given by my dad when I first started working on this family line. But because I knew they were from Loch Ray, I was able to order the church records from the LDS on microfilm and was able to gather this information on the same 4 generations. Basically what I did for a period of 9 months to a year, I would go down to the family history library at a local LDS church, and I would use their microfilm readers. I'd go probably once or twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week, and spend a couple of hours just looking through the church registers for marriages and baptisms for the family. Every single time I saw the name Sweeney, I took a copy of that page, and I would get home and I would cluster all the pages into piles on my bed according to the family. And I was able to actually firm up information in my dad's original list, as well as delete some of the information because it was incorrect. And in 2009, I organized a family reunion in Loch Ray. Over 100 people came. And we were all able to actually figure out once and for all how we were related to each other. And these are grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people on the list you see. And nobody was ever really to pinpoint down for certainty all of this relationship. So because of what I did, we were all able to actually know how we're related to each other. Now, the general size of Ireland, I wanted to explain this. I gave a class, this particular class, at an Albuquerque West Stake Family History Conference in September of 2014. I wanted to give the class an idea of how big Ireland is compared to the state of New Mexico. Now, the island of Ireland has 32 counties. The state of New Mexico has 33. They have currently over 6 million people, and we have currently over 2 million. But the general size of Ireland, as far as square miles goes, they are 1/4 the size of our state. That's the whole island that could fit into one corner of our state. So why is it so hard to find records for our ancestors? Across the top, I have the Census Years. Started in 1821. I stopped in 1911. It goes beyond that, but that's all we can access right now. Ireland has a 100-year law where if anyone was born up to 100 years ago, their information cannot be made public record. Hopefully, Ireland's government gets through the red tape and they release the 1921 census to us soon. Across the bottom are major event years that impacted how we as genealogists can find information on our ancestors. And this is only some of the events, but these impacted pretty heavily. Started in the 1840s and 50s, when immigration happened prior to the year 1864. And that's significant. I'll show you that in a moment. But heavy immigration happened not just because of the potato famine in the late 1840s, but also because of the time frame when the land taxes were heavily enforced by the landlords in Ireland. When Griffith's valuation was completed, the landlords were able to actually evict people because they couldn't pay their tax. But the landlords also found a loophole. If a property in Griffith's valuation was valued at £5 or less, the tenant was not responsible for paying the tax. They were basically eliminated from the responsibility, but the landlord still had to pay the tax to the government. So landlords found loopholes, and they would evict tenants who lived on those little properties, merge that piece of property to an adjoining property, and the new tenants had to pay the tax. This simply allowed the landlord not to have to dole out his precious pennies. However, it resulted in this era, probably 10 to 15 year strength, of having 1/4 the whole population emigrate. Now, they came to America for multiple reasons, and a couple of the big ones are probably because of the gold rush that happened in California in the late 1840s and 1850s, early 1850s. But also it came very easy to travel to America, more easy than it had in the past. So a lot of people came to America, besides Canada and Australia, etc. Now, civil registration began in the year 1864, and this impacts us because if basically what civil registration was all births, marriages, and deaths, regardless of religion, were required to be recorded starting that year. So if your ancestors were Catholics and they were born or got married prior to 1864 in Ireland, you're going to have a hard time finding records. We're going to have to hunt much harder. Unless your ancestor got married 1845 and after, and they were non-Catholics. In 1845, marriage registration was required for non-Catholics. So you have a chance if your ancestor was non-Catholic and they got married 1845 or after. Now we have a wave of dates in our census years that were destroyed. In 1886, in the yellow, 2 decades were destroyed on accident. The government in Dublin didn't understand what they were supposed to keep and what they were supposed to destroy that year. During World War I, in the orange, 2 decades were destroyed because they needed to make pulp, probably because of a paper shortage during the war. In the red, 4 decades in 1922, 4 decades were almost entirely destroyed because of the fire in the Four Courts buildings downtown Dublin during the Civil War. Now notice the photograph in the lower right corner. That is an image of burning buildings of the Four Courts downtown Dublin. But the image above it, that's copyright of the RTE Stills Library. That's a mushroom cloud. That doesn't look to me like that's one mortar shell or two mortar shells or even a building starting to burn. That to me represents when the arsenal that everyone says the rebels had stored in one of the buildings blew up. That's a mushroom cloud. I am severely impacted by this photo. This touches me deeply. My ancestors' names are in that ash right there. Now, not all of the four census years that are in red were destroyed. There are remnants available online for various counties in the various years, and they are now available for viewing online at the National Archives or at FamilySearch.org. But in all this chaos, in all this destruction of records and difficulty in finding our ancestors in Ireland records, there is one thing that's very significant to us as researchers today. Civil registration began in 1864. If our ancestors were born or got married in Ireland after that date, we have a really good shot at finding records. Now that was decades before American states, many American states I should say, were required to have their counties record birth, marriages, and deaths. And that is a really good thing. That is our glasses half full scenario when we're hunting Irish ancestors. So where do we begin? In order to find the location in Ireland, we've got to start looking in America. You've got to talk to your relatives. Gather tidbits of information. See if anybody has postcards or letters they kept. Does anybody have an old scrap piece of paper that shows a family tree written by an aunt or an uncle years and years ago? You want to talk to them to find out what information they have that you don't have. You're going to search in a variety of American records. You don't want to say, oh, I've got a 1903 census that says they came over in 1901, or I beg your pardon, a 1910 census saying they came over in 1901. You need more than one document to say when they came over. Most of the time, because of memory, these dates will vary. So you really need to pinpoint down when they arrived in America as well as where they're from. You're going to gather all the information available. Look at the big picture. Don't restrict yourself to one clue that you're just really sure they're from Roscommon. You've got to find something else to hopefully back that up. And you need to do cluster genealogy. That's critical, especially with Irish ancestors. Families stuck together. Cousins lived with each other for years, or in the neighborhoods of each other, or worked together. And in our next part of the series, I'm going to discuss cluster genealogy and show you a very important discovery I just recently made on why you really need to do it. Thank you for watching.